Ben Gretch is a fantasy analyst who's done work at places like RotoViz and CBS Sports. He's known for his comprehensive work with stealing signals. He's half of the Stealing Bananas podcast. He's a ship chaser, and he makes you think deeper about fantasy football. These are his late round perspectives. I was thinking, man, how's it feel to be talking to an Omni thought leader right now?
You know what's funny about that? I just updated it the other day. You are absolutely crushing it, but I'm trying to run you down. It's a battle between me and you in our Omni Fantasy League.
It's hilarious, dude. So actually, do you want to explain to people what Omni's all about and stuff? Since you're obviously the one who introduced me to it.
Yeah, it's basically a mix between the futures market and fantasy sports. So we're drafting like teams instead of players across all the different sports and trying to predict champions, winners of each sport. So the Super Bowl champion, the NBA Finals champion, college football, college basketball, every sport. Basketball, we have the rotational sports. So like last year or this current year, we had the World Baseball Classic, we had the Women's World Cup. The ones that are not an annual, we incorporate them the years that they run. NASCAR, like every sport, golf, tennis, all of them. And then you won the league last year and then started this year insanely hot with you won because we draft in like February, and you won the first few champions.
I did. What's so funny about it, dude, and I've like talked to friends about this because it's laughably like just so lucky, right? But like last year, I mean, like I had a process for it, but it was definitely not like this was not the expectation. Last year in the league that ended up winning, I drafted the NBA champion and the NCAA tournament champion. So both college basketball and the NBA, and the same thing happened this year. The exact same thing. I'm not even like the biggest NBA fan in the world. I love college basketball, but not to the standpoint of like what I'm doing with football or anything like that. And it's hilarious the way that just sort of like played itself out. But I had to throw that out there that, I am getting that W this year.
You're crushing. I'm looking at our draft right now. I had the 101. So like I took Novak Djokovic, right? Like he tends to dominate tennis. Although you have Carlos Alcaraz, who's the up and coming guy. Right. And they have one more tournament that the next January's Australian Open will be the fourth one that will count. And they're 1-2 right now. So whoever does better there will win tennis. But you took the Nuggets in the 5th round, right? And you took UConn Huskies in the 17th round, and you picked the champion of those two sports.
It's so ridiculous. It's so ridiculous. But you guys should definitely check it out. Omni Fantasy. You probably have sent links out and stuff on Twitter and whatnot.
Yeah, omnifantasy.com. We'll be drafting again in January and February. It's a post football season thing. But if that sounds fun, you can join the Substack, omnifantasy.substack.com. You'll get notifications, emails from there.
Yeah, cool. I'm really pumped to have you on, man. You're one of the guests that people have talked about most to come on. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that we definitely are not just player take driven. And I think that's partially why folks have said, hey, you and Gretch should have a conversation on perspectives and sort of talk about this stuff. You are, though, one of the higher level thinkers in fantasy football. And it's unfortunate that we don't really see a ton of like higher level strategy, that kind of stuff, that type of thinking within the fantasy space. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that player analysis is just easier. There's a lot of work that goes into not just thinking of like these abstract ideas within the fantasy football space and within football, but also coming up with those ideas and then researching those ideas and talking about those ideas. It's not an easy thing to do, but I do want to ask you, where do you think that comes from? Like, what kinds of things maybe in your life or the kinds of hobbies you have or like the things that you read have sort of directed you into this spot where, you're not just this player take machine, you're really looking at this from a different perspective?
Yeah. It's so funny because I always like break down the third wall on pods, but just behind the scenes, I'm sure your listeners know, like, so you send over some of these questions and I messaged you back and was like, I love these questions because they are what I think they get at what I like to write about and talk about so well. And it's so cool when someone is asking you the things that you already are passionate about talking about or want to talk about. And there's no one I'd rather talk about it with than you. So when you said all that just now, it's like, I mean, it's so exciting. I mean, I'm really thrilled for this conversation. It's going to be a blast. In terms of, well, first of all, that idea, I'm a high level thinker is, I don't think of myself that way. I'll take the compliment. But in terms of where it comes from, for me, it has always been, this passion for football since a young age. Like I grew up really into it. I don't know why this is the thing that just popped in my head, like right this moment, not something I prepared, but my parents sold their house like 2 years ago and we went through some old stuff, and my mom found this thing I did for, it says in the corner, age 6, first grade. And it's me writing up, the Vikings winning the Super Bowl over the Oilers and this whole story. And it's got like Mike Merriweather's name in it and stuff. And like, I'm a 6-year-old. Like I was like, what is this? Like, this is insane. Like half the words aren't even spelled correctly, but I know who Mike Merriweather is. Like, it's just really ridiculous. Because that's the guy he was the guy I used to always be when I was the Vikings and Tecmo Super Bowl. Right. So loved this stuff as a kid. Loved the stats as a kid. I have an older brother and then 2 older stepbrothers and then a stepbrother who's a year younger than me. And so we did a lot of, playing sports as kids, right? We played wiffle ball. We played all sorts of football and basketball and stuff. We had a field goal kicking game we used to play where we set up a field goal post in our backyard and then, a scoring system that would make it so the scores were like reflect NFL scores. So the final score would be like 24-17 or something based on, you had these spots where you kicked from. The deeper ones were worth a touchdown. The shorter ones were worth a field goal, stuff like that. Yeah. And anyway, when we would play all this stuff, we would keep a spiral notebook and have stats for the whole league and everything. So like it's all of that stuff from a young age. And then as I got a little older, it was, Madden and NCAA football, even more so the dynasty mode. And and that's something where, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say, were you someone who would just chill out with your buddies and you guys would draft a team in Madden and just simulate and just manage the team as opposed to just straight up playing the games and stuff?
I did that. I definitely did that before. We did a fantasy football season on Madden one time, which like in an off season. Yeah.
Nice.
I think it was just me and like 1 or 2 other buddies, but we like, drafted teams, simulated it and like tallied up scores. Because we started our league before it was online. I mean, we did the newspaper stuff for a couple of years.
Yeah.
But the NCAA football game was a big one for me, and it was this dynasty mode. And to your question about like why do I enjoy looking at the game this way, I think it really started from a lot of that stuff. People have used Madden generation to talk about why like a lot of observers are better at like the timeout management and some of that kind of X's and like not the X's and O's, the clock management and the game situational management than even NFL coaches, which sounds absurd, right? Because we know that NFL coaches have way more experience than us, except when it comes to stuff like that, they maybe don't, because the people that are playing simulations over and over again are getting so much experience and they're like hacking and they're trying 4th down, go for it. They're calling timeouts way more than an NFL coach with all the other things in their job is really only managing those game situations 16 times a year, 17 times a year now, right? They only have those a couple live reps for how they might want to manage their timeouts and stuff. It's not that crazy to think that somebody sitting on their couch actually knows that better than an NFL coach.
Right.
And there are elements of this that of Madden and NCAA football that I think can apply similarly. And I think that's really where my like love of the schemes and all that stuff probably came from playing these video games a little bit, where it's like, understanding different offenses. You're doing when I played the NCAA football, you're recruiting. And then the fun thing about it is like they graduate and you have new players and you got to figure out a different scheme, right? And like at a young age, you realize, the early days, it was the scrambling quarterbacks. Mike Vick was like so good in Madden. Eventually it becomes, harder to do that. And you got to figure out the route concepts and be able to actually, throw down field. And I remember like the first time I had like a really fast receiver, I'd run him on a bunch of drag routes, right? And then it's like, you got to get him past the line of scrimmage where it's going to get knocked down and then hit him in space. And then he runs with it, but you better have an accurate quarterback, because if it's off target, he's going to get, he's going to slow down to catch it in the simulation. And like literally what we're seeing in this artificial simulation, like helping me understand something that I think to this day, you look at like the ways that like the Dolphins are utilizing Tyreek Hill and getting him to space and how important it is to get him the ball on him and create yak after the catch. It's like, I remember trying to do that in NCAA football. Right. And so there's elements of it that I think I actually honestly still take and like, how to deploy certain personnel and those things. And I do think it's super, super important to understanding the NFL, because I think every team is a little bit different, and the ways that they're trying to go about things and their schemes and the ways that they're utilizing their players is different.
Yeah, I was actually having this conversation with some friends earlier today, and we're gonna get to some of this to some degree, later in the show. But I think that people still underrate scheme and situation for individual talent and player eval, right? Like you look at someone like Devon Achane, or for instance, right? Devon Achane in Pittsburgh is not the same player as Devon Achane in Miami,
Right.
and it's okay to say that that's the case, and that we're looking at these multiple layers of how good these guys are going to actually perform and do. And so you bring up scheme and you looking at that stuff. I mean, I would argue that it's a bigger deal than player analysis a lot of times, because not only is it a bigger deal because it's such an important piece to how well a player performs, but player analysis is everywhere, right? Player analysis, you can get information from literally, you Google anything and you can find player analysis in fantasy football. And, I played in my home league, and my dad's in it. This is like this 22nd year of my home league, right? And my dad's in it. He's, in his 70s now. He doesn't know exactly what's going on but he's picking up sleepers during our auction draft because he can literally, he's reading my stuff because he's a great dad, but like he can just go online and find, oh, this list has these guys as sleepers, and therefore I'm going to draft those players. It's a lot harder to integrate the stuff about scheme and the higher level stuff into your fantasy football strategy and approach than it is to say, oh, this guy's good, this guy isn't good. I think that's another really, really important piece of this. And to your point, you do stealing signals. It's amazing. Everyone needs to check it out if they can. And again, we'll talk about it at the very end. You can let everyone know where to do that. I've read it, and I've known that, through the years reading it and checking it out, that you're obviously a data person, but you don't only look at things in a data-driven way, which I think is very, very important. But back in the day, like a decade ago, there were these back and forths on fantasy Twitter all the time about film versus stats. What's more important? Are you a film guy or are you a stats guy? What's your take on that whole thing now today in 2023 and how that sort of collides and works together in fantasy analysis?
Well, first of all, the back in the day, I came in a little later than you and some others, but to the extent that I was a part of those debates, I was firmly team data, and I would say I still am. Like, not to like come at anyone, but I do think it's fair to point out that some people have strengths and weaknesses in other areas. I think a lot of the traditional film people don't necessarily do a great job of applying their analysis. I think they have good film takes and they understand the game in a lot of the ways that I was just talking about, taking stuff from video games. Like, they understand a lot of these X's and O's things. But like, one of the things I love about you, you're often talking about how like we're just nerds. Like we're playing a board game. We're playing some nerdy thing that has a fake scoring system. Just because you can analyze football is not going to make you necessarily be able to apply it on the data side and on the number side and how these things come together. You have to have a mix of both. But I do, over the years, I started very data heavy. And over the years, I have shifted more. And in the last question, I was talking all about my childhood, but you asked like why I think it's so important to look at the bigger picture stuff. And the NFL is this living, evolving thing, right? And so we have a couple examples I wrote down. Pass rate over time, right? We've seen like a huge shift in pass rate. We have the scheme changes based on rules changes and things like that. A decade ago, shotgun was just becoming like more and more popular. Like It's just in the time that I've been a fantasy writer, where I know early in my career I was writing about how shotgun was picking up and 3 wide receiver sets. Now we're in this current 2 high shell era, trying to take away the explosives on defense and how that impacts what the offenses are able to do. And so you have eras and time frames and things that are impacting the ways that the offenses can scheme and what they want to do, but also how they're able to do it. And then what players benefit in those types of things. And all of that is so important in addition to the player, profiles and a lot of those elements. And like some of your great models that you have built for like young players, for rookies and year 2 players, those types of things are very important on the player level as well. But we do have to understand the context of how does it fit into the scheme and where's the NFL going, right? Yeah. And so there's a lot of elements there that are really interesting. I do think there's a huge advantage to watching the games when you are a data person who understands it. And you're not like, I don't think that means you're a film guy, but I do think if you understand fantasy, the nerd game, understand data, and then you're watching the games for yourself, like you're understanding how that data is being compiled in a way that you're going to be able to apply it and have a real edge that people on both sides of this film versus data thing don't necessarily bridge that gap. The data people, I think, are too focused on the box score sometimes. The film people, I don't think, can apply down to the statistical level what that means for fantasy. They're like, I really like this guy in film, draft him on your fantasy league, but they don't understand the market. They don't understand the dynamics around, and so you see, and the reality of football as well, and we obviously talk about this a ton in our stuff, but it's small samples all the way down, right? It's an evolving sport, and even multi-year things, it creates, segmented small samples because there's changes in offenses and things. So what is so rare is a consistently dominant player over a long career. And we all like to think about this in Dynasty. Like this guy is, Jamar Chase is going to be a great receiver for the next decade. Well, I mean, a lot of things have to happen there, right? I mean, and he is tied to Joe Burrow. It probably can happen, but that's rare, right? Like what Travis Kelce and Mahomes have done over the last 5 years, that doesn't happen as much as we want to believe it does. There's a lot of high-level producers that then don't do anything for, another several years for whatever reason, right?
Yeah. I think the other thing too with the data versus film stuff is that I think that what you're sort of getting at too is that if you have like a baseline of understanding football, I'm not going to sit here and analyze film the way that Kurt Warner does, right? It's just, it would be ridiculously stupid for me to think that I can do that. It's no different than any other. I mean, like I'm probably within the fantasy football space, like a 50th percentile film watcher, if you will, right? Like there's nothing like overly special about the way that, but I am watching everything, every game, every single week, all the time, because I want to sound competent when I'm talking about this stuff. And I think it is helpful. But at the same time, if you understand the basic concepts of what's going on a football field and you understand the trends at a high level and where things are moving, it'll help you discover data then while you're searching for data and while you're researching to then come up with new and different ideas to then help you with game theory and help you with strategy. I think a great example of this is what you did over the offseason that I then sort of piled on with the RPO stuff, where you researched what happens to pass catchers when they're on these RPO heavy teams. And then I was like, wow, this is really interesting. We did a podcast with CBS on it a little bit. And I was like, afterwards, I'm like, I got to research this a little bit more. And there was a little bit of signal in there that heavy RPO teams tend to focus their target share on one guy. And it makes sense logically if you understand what goes down with an RPO, and that whenever they do end up throwing it, they're doing it in a very fast decision-making process. And so they're not able to just go read after read after read like they're just chilling in the pocket. It's a much different situation. And so as a result, when you can combine this narrative and this story with the data and just understanding football at a baseline, it's nothing crazy. It's just that if you can understand that and then you have the understanding and resources to dive into the data, it can be really, really helpful.
I mean, completely. I mean, I think that's, to your point about when you're watching it, it helps you find data like that. I write the stealing signal. You mentioned we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but it's a game by game recap every week. And so much of it is from watching the games. Like I'm making notes during the games, look up this player's air yards, look up this is a trend that I saw in this game. Like I kind of have an idea of what the stats are before I even look at the box score, because I'm thinking through these things as exactly as you just described. And that's where like some of the RPO stuff came as well. If you're watching the game and trying to think about what they're actually doing, what their scheme is, what their coaches are trying to do in the game plan, what is their goal, what's the defense trying to take away, it's going to help you understand what the actual box score is telling you a lot more, and whether or not, as I like to do in my column, whether it's signal or noise, right? Like that's what I end up kind of trying to boil it down to. And some of the stuff, it's important because it is data, it is statistics, but you can kind of pretty comfortably be like, that's sort of noisy. Like that happened for a very contextual reason within that game, right? And you can kind of see it in real time.
Let's talk about stealing signals for a second, because to me, when you sort of go out on this venture and you're creating this new piece of content and you're digging as deep as you are, I mean, I don't have a single piece of content that does digs as nearly as deep as what stealing signals does, for instance, right? Like you're going so in depth game by game. What's been helpful most for you with that column? Because I think like if I go to 15 transactions, for instance, the thing that's really helpful for me is that I'm forcing myself to really look at the market and look at the way people are viewing players. And it helps me as a fantasy manager then it's not like I'm just recommending things that I'm not using myself, right? It's very important for people to understand that. I'm not just like blowing smoke and just saying, hey, I'm doing the exact same thing, right? And so for you, while you're analyzing this stuff, what's been really helpful with stealing signals for you as a fantasy manager?
Well, and it's so funny because a big part of it for me, and what I always tell the readers is, it's just me sort of going through an analytical process game by game, how I would break it down, but I write it up. And obviously it's gotten bigger and deeper over the years. I've been doing this since I think the 2017 season was the first year I did it. So it's added a lot of layers. The first couple years was just some notes. And now it's I go way too long sometimes, as you alluded to, but it is what it is. Right. But I approach it like this stream of consciousness. I'm thinking out loud. These are the things I'm considering. And then here's what I think is signal and noise right at the end. But in terms of, going to that depth every week, in terms of what is the most beneficial for me, I really do think it's this idea of how different the context is for the different organizations, for the different schemes, and understanding not just we're just talking about the whole league is this living, evolving entity. I think each offense, each team, each scheme within a season can be thought of as this living, evolving thing. And when we talk about a lot of draft strategies, like zero RB, a big idea of it is projections, for example, are pretty fragile for a full season because they're kind of more focused on week one in the early part of the year. And things happen throughout the year. NFL seasons are chaos, injuries happen. And I just like to think about it again as it is this evolving thing where teams are trying to figure out what works and what they can continuously do successfully, and that other teams aren't going to then try to take away, because a lot of times they do something successfully for a few weeks and then a defense can figure out a way to stop that. And then they have to have pivots off of that. One of the fascinating things about fantasy to this point is sometimes it's something that defenses don't want to take away. So Adam Thielen, this is how I describe Adam Thielen. He just sits down 3 yards downfield.
Right.
And Bryce Young, the Panthers are okay with it because the other receivers aren't winning and they want their rookie quarterback to have somewhere to go with the ball. So they don't mind him having this basically a tight end outlet. And the defenses don't care because they're if you're going to throw to your 30-plus-year-old receiver 3 yards downfield, we're going to take that bet. Sometimes he's getting some yak. A lot of the times he's not. It's his last game, he averaged 4 yards per reception or something.
The Panthers ADOT's 5.5 this year. So it's just all driven by Adam Thielen.
But it works well for our game, even though it's not because the Panthers are okay with it as part of their offense because a lot of the other stuff isn't functional. It's not like they're going to try to replace. I think a good team would try to replace that over time. They would try to push the ball downfield. They don't have the receivers to win downfield. The defenses are okay with it. So where's it going to go? It's going to keep happening. And that's part of their evolution as an offense. It's not a positive evolution. That's not a good team.
Yeah.
But what it means is a lot of targets for Adam Thielen. Unfortunately, for someone like me who doesn't draft a lot of guys like Adam Thielen.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, it's a very interesting thought that inside of a season there's these micro seasons almost for a lot of these teams. And I think the Thielen thing's a really good example where you can go into a season as an analyst, as a player, and think a certain thing about an offense, the way that it's going to go down. And I think what stealing signals is really impactful and helpful for is understanding that delta and that change from where we were at the start of the season. Whereas a lot of people just kind of have take lock and player lock where, I didn't draft a lot of Adam Thielen this year. The trends that I look at, all that kind of stuff, I'm usually going after young, rookie, unproven guys in the late rounds and such. And, every once in a while, age isn't that big of a factor from an ADP trend standpoint in the late rounds. But when you attach him to a rookie quarterback, I'm no, I'm not going to go hard after Adam Thielen this season. And then we see what we're seeing, and it might not make sense from a real football perspective, but it can make sense from a fantasy football perspective. It's similar to how some teams don't really care if they're that bad against the run defensively because at the end of the day, it's the Chargers did that for a little while where, the Chargers defense just sucks in general, but where if you're giving up chunk plays on the ground, or if you're allowing 4.5 yards instead of 4 yards per carry, the difference there really isn't that significant. You'd rather be better against the pass than against the run in today's NFL. So in fantasy, right, against the Chargers defense or against whatever defense that's bad at stopping the run, there's obviously an impact, but from a real football perspective, it might not there might not be as big of a delta there and an impact there.
Right. And it's what are they trying to do? Why are they allowing that? And then we need to be able to apply it to the opposing offense. Well, if they're committing all the resources to stopping the pass and the opposing offenses are running at a high rate as a result and efficiently, right? Mm-hmm. But also the run rate's higher. Maybe we're not going to be playing their receivers that week because we know that, especially if it's a team that has a tendency to fall into that and be run heavy. Maybe it's the Lions, right, with their great offense. I mean, this isn't a great example because they just played a massive shootout last week. You were talking about the Chargers of a few years ago, obviously.
Yeah. But even last week, we saw them with a 4th and 5 just running the ball against LA.
Right, that's
insane.
true.
Insanity.
Yeah.
Insane.
And this gets back to this concept of tacit knowledge I've written about before. And if you do go to my Stealing Signals Substack, it's the pinned article up there. And it's like, the subtitle's like a pitch for why you should subscribe to Stealing Signals, or what I'm trying to do. But this concept of tacit knowledge, I originally stole it from Jonathan Bales, but he's quoting from an article from a man named Cedric Chin. He wrote this article called Why Tacit Knowledge is More Important Than Deliberate Practice. I recommend looking it up and reading the whole thing. It's fantastic. But this is a passage from it that is something you do in your work, and it's going to resonate with you. It's something that I do in my work. But it's, people with expertise in any sufficiently complicated domain will always explain their expertise with things like, well, do X, except when you see Y, then do Z because A. And if you see B, then do P. But if you see A and C, but not B, then do Q because reason D. And then there are weird situations where you do Z, but then see thing C emerge, and then you should switch to Q. And the whole point is, like, we can't actually really explain some of these things. Like the whole Adam Thielen conversation we just had is because like several elements are in play, including the rookie quarterback and including all these things.
Right.
And then it just fits and it comes together and you're like, I mean, I can't really fight this trend. It is a real trend and it's going to probably stick as a result of several of these P, Q, and X things that are all present in this situation. And it is something that, like, that type of context is necessary. There's so many people that want to be able to find the magic spell for fantasy and like what thing is going to help me pick out the winners every year. And for me, and this gets back to your question about the stats and film thing, watching the game, studying the game from a numbers perspective, immersing yourself in all of it is the way that you're going to be the most successful. I know not everyone has the time for that, but that's what you and I are doing. And that's what we're here for. I really do think it does marginally improve the takes to be doing all of those things, because football is a complicated. A lot of people love, I mean, I love this about your Twitter. I've told you this. People love to come at you, and you do an awesome job of the back and forth. But one of the things I've seen you highlight before is when people come at you and say, you're a fantasy football analyst, don't take yourself so seriously. And it's hilarious that I'm quoting something that says a sufficiently complicated domain. We're not rocket science or scientists, right? Like, we don't take ourselves that seriously, but it is a highly competitive industry. There's a lot of people doing analysis. It is complicated. It's a schematic, tactical sport, right? That's what we were talking about earlier. This isn't baseball where it's one-on-one. It isn't, pitcher hitter. This isn't basketball where it's, there's still 5 players moving around, but it's only 5 on each side. Football is more complicated. There are individual plays. There are individual schemes that offenses and defense are going to align positively, or, they're not going to align well for the defense in some cases. And it's just, this offense is going to crush this defense because of scheme reasons. It's all very, like I said, tactical and nuanced. It is complicated, even though, we are nerds playing Dungeons and Dragons. Like, it's still complicated, right?
Yeah. I mean, look, I don't take myself too seriously, but I take my job seriously. I know that it's that the subject matter and all of that is completely irrelevant in the grand scheme of things from like a worldview perspective. I'm not a doctor. I'm not doing things that are necessarily directly impacting the world. I know that I give people an outlet and all that kind of stuff, and I'm very grateful for that, right? But I do take being right, for instance, seriously. I see a lot of fantasy analysts that they don't care about their results at the end of the season. I literally do podcasts on what I got right and what I got wrong because I want to be better the following season. I think that's very, very important to at least like get across, is that we're doing stupid things. I mean, like, this is dumb, right? Like
very dumb.
Like what it is very dumb, but it's an important piece to American culture. It's an important piece to people's lives as an outlet. It's a good hobby, and people want to win at the end of the day. And I don't want to be a fantasy analyst that people listen to and they start yelling at on Reddit and start talking junk on and stuff. And to your point about, the excerpt that you read, the other thing that I've really come to realize over the last few years is, I've gotten I'd say like the number one feedback that I've gotten as a fantasy analyst is that I'm not, I don't have enough, like, I don't want to say not enough hot takes, but I'm not like strong enough in the takes that I have, if you will. I'll say buy this player, sell this player, but then there's always this gray area, right? But to me, an analyst, an expert, and someone who understands what's going on in such a complicated game where we're trying to predict what humans are going to do on a football field, you have to use words like probably to describe what's going on You know, like it's okay to say that. It doesn't mean that you're going to get things wrong more than you're going to get things right. The opposite is true. When you understand that variance and you understand that things aren't going to be clean, like you and I play in a ton of leagues together. You've seen me make dumb trades. Like we've both made stupid moves throughout our fantasy playing career. But the idea here is that we're making way more good moves than bad moves throughout a season, throughout multiple seasons in Dynasty. And it's okay whenever you get things wrong, because it's going to happen. And saying, probably, this is probably going to happen. This is the way this backfield will probably be split moving forward. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's a human thing, and it's the important. Yeah, it's a humbling thing to say, right? You like I'm not sitting here just saying like this is exactly how it's going to go because I know. No, I don't. I don't know. No. I'm not in these locker rooms. I don't know exactly how it's going to play out.
Right, and that gets back to the things I was just saying about what's complicated. The other huge thing is all of these teams are guarding everything. Like I mean, like look at the whole Michigan sign sealing scandal, right? Like their playbooks are guarded. Teams pick up players that were recently cut from a different team just to get the inside look on that future opponent, because if they have them next on the schedule, they'll go sign someone who was recently cut because he's been in practices for that team, and they just bring him in sometimes for a week, literally like sign him for a week, pay him a one game check to get him to help them, and the point is that the offenses, the defenses, the schemes are all very closely guarded secrets. You and I are not in the locker rooms, like you just said. We don't know what they're doing. We're making assumptions. And then the other important thing you said is, over time, yes, we're gonna be trying to make more right moves than wrong moves. And typically, I am in leagues with you. You're very good at this, and I think I'm pretty decent at it too. We're usually gonna come out that way. But when we don't, the other really important thing you said is then we self-reflect, right? At the end of the season, you're looking at your takes. Why did I miss so much? Like I had a tough season in 2022, one of my toughest in like 5 years. It was a lot of the players I was heavily on got hurt. Like things didn't go necessarily great on some of the key teams. Had a lot of Kyle Pitts last year. A lot of things just didn't go the way that I necessarily wanted them to. Still won a couple leagues, still had some successes because the way that you structure things are going to work out. But I spent a lot of time this offseason trying to understand why. What is changing? And again, back to the macro stuff. Why was scoring down? Why did that impact things? Because I often don't draft a lot of running backs, take a lot of receivers. A lot of those receivers didn't have the seasons I wanted them to. And some of that had to do with the whole macro stuff. Spend a lot of time analyzing those things to figure it out. And I think I'm feeling, some of it's variance. I'm having a better year in 2023. And I think that's because I'm, seeing the fruits of some of that. And it is important, like you said, though, I think it's so key. The intentional self-reflection and willingness to be like, yeah, this was a bad take. And not a lot of people in our industry do it, man. Especially like it's a tough thing for up and comers. I had a really hard time doing it when I was new in the industry. You want to be an expert. You want people to recognize that your takes are right and they're good, and you take your victory laps on everything you say that it's correct. And I totally understand that urge, and I get that. The people the young analysts that I have the most respect for are the ones that I see thinking critically about things they got wrong and why they got them wrong, and trying to grow and trying to learn and those things. And I mean, it doesn't mean you have to beat yourself up publicly all the time either. Like some people take that too far as well, but it's so important to think critically because you're not going to get everything right. But this is a really competitive industry where there is pressure to be right about everything. And so it's hard to toe that line, certainly.
I totally agree. I understand why analysts are out there victory lapping and celebrating their wins, and maybe they're quiet with their losses. I get it. I mean, it's a very instinctual thing to do within a pretty competitive space. I also think that you can apply this same thing, though, to just being a player. Any listener who's not an analyst, which is going to be the majority of people, if you're playing in a lot of leagues and you had a really, really good season, understand that there are things that go on, like in the fantasy playoffs, where tons and tons of variance exist, right? Like if you won 3 games in the fantasy playoffs and you were not didn't have a bye or anything like that, like a lot went your way in order to win that championship. Don't just look at the result and say, "Oh, I was good this year because I won 2 out of my 9 leagues or something, or 3 out of my 9 leagues or what have you." Understand what went down, whether you got lucky or not. And see if it's a process that can be, duplicated and replicated in some way. I think though the greater piece to this is that instead of, you can be excited about hits, of course, but there's no reason for me to, it's really easy for me and you at this point. This is our jobs, this is what we do. This is, we're a part of this community, if you will, it's very easy for me to sit back and be like, yeah, I mean, like, I got Christian Watson wrong this year. Like, it's not panning out. I'm going to reflect at the end of the season and see exactly why it didn't pan out. But it's not panning out. I mean, he's like borderline droppable in a lot of leagues at this point. Whereas I got Rachaad White right. Like, things went my way with Rachaad White. And so, but like, there's no reason for me to go on social media and say, look at how well Rachaad White's doing, because someone could just respond and say, you told me to draft Bijan Robinson in the first round, like, like it's just the way that it is. And it's easy for me now though, where I'm like, okay, I've been doing this for years and years and I have this backbone and people trust me. And I'm very confident in the process that I have to not really fret, getting things wrong and just be open about it and such. But, what I'm basically trying to get to here is that if you are just playing the game yourself, don't look at those individual player takes and don't look at those individual draft picks that you had and say, oh, I just got this right because I'm good. Like, understand what led you to that point and getting that right. And maybe it's just, I listened to the right fantasy analyst. That's fine. Like, if you're trying to find the right mesh for you and your brain and the way that you operate, that's totally fine. But the thing that I hate more than anything, I even said this like halfway through the season with Rachaad White. It's like, don't have me, JJ, as an analyst. I shouldn't live and die by one player in your mind as an analyst. Yeah. Like, that's insane. Like, if I led you to White and then you held him through the tough times and you want to be thankful because you read my draft guide, or like Sam Laporta or something like that. Like, I get it. You're excited, but I really truly don't want people to only like Isaiah Pacheco last year, right? I was into him. My prospect guy liked him. My prospect model liked him. I don't want to live and die by one player because it's going to go south the next time that you do it. I know how this works,
I did the same thing with, like, I got a lot of positive feedback for AJ Brown for a couple of years. I've been really high on him since his rookie year, and he's basically always beat his expectation. And Stephon Diggs, the first year he went to Buffalo, was another one that pops in my head when you were saying that. And in both cases, I remember the year after, I was like, I'm not going to act like I have some magical cure to predict this mid-round receiver that's going to be, a first-round value. I don't think I can do that again next time. I just was playing a probability, like you were saying a minute ago. There's some upside here. I really like this guy. A lot of reasons to be in on him at this cost, and the ceiling hit. Like, Diggs' first season in Buffalo is a great example where I was arguing, look, Minnesota never really gave him the full role. They were using him in a low A-dot role, then a high A-dot role, and then there's a chance that he's the legit number one. They were trying to acquire Antonio Brown. They didn't get him. They go get Diggs. They trade a bunch of, capital to get him. And he ends up being that in the first year. But in addition to him getting targets at all depths for the first time, Josh Allen has a breakthrough. Exactly. Their pass rate explodes.
Right.
It's like, I mean, I had no idea that it was going to hit to that level. Exactly. Right? I mean, that's crazy.
Exactly. And that's the way that I feel about basically all of my hits. Lamar Jackson, his MVP season, really, really into Lamar. He had an unbelievable passing touchdown rate. Like, I'm not predicting that kind of insanity to happen. And so what I'm saying, I don't want people to think in a results-oriented way when it comes to the fantasy analysis that they're consuming. I think it's more important to look at analysts who are showing their work and what led to getting to that point. I think that's Absolutely. What's the biggest key with everything that we're doing, within fantasy analysis. One question I have to ask every analyst that pops on this show, and we kind of alluded to this a little bit, we're talking about it a little bit right now, but what do you think fantasy managers consistently get wrong as they're playing?
I think the biggest one that I would emphasize is a concept that I've heard best described by the phrase misapplying the aggregate in the specific. So we do a lot of analysis in fantasy where we do a lot of like cohorts and, groupings and a lot of that stuff is really important. I think there's a lot of intelligent ways to be looking at like ranges of outcomes through like comp groups and things like that. Right. But we were just talking a lot about how the different schemes are unique and there is context. And one of the things that I see as an issue with the misapplying the aggregate, I mean, there's a lot of ways that I think this is done poorly. One is arbitrary cutoffs, right? You'll see like the 50 or more of this stat and 25% or more of this stat, and the player they're putting into that group is right at 50 and right at 25.
Yes.
And then the whole comp group is significally better than that. And so it's not really a range of outcomes. It's just everything that's better than the mark that person's at.
Yes.
That's, I mean, you're creating a comp group that's not, not working. there's a lot of analyses when we look at the league level, though, where there are these examples, and this is, I think, a way that the aggregate is used intelligently in the specific. But people like you, I've heard a lot of analysts talk about this. When we look at like maybe like team level data, a lot of times like for a particular stat, it might only be really relevant for like the top 3 teams and the bottom 3 teams. And then we have this other 26 teams where we're like, yeah, there's kind of a lot of variance in here, but there is signal, at the tails, right? I mean, the one that comes to my mind as I say that is pass rate over expected this year. We have the Chiefs way up there, and we have Washington like way up there with them, and Cincinnati. And then like you get down a few more teams and you're like, okay, if you're at plus 3% or minus 3% relative to expected, that's all kind of in a wash. And then you get way down to the bottom, the Falcons are bottom of the league. Yeah, that's relevant. Like that's a tail outcome that, I mean, so we're, but then what happens, I think, with the cohorts and stuff, and often I see, to get back to this aggregate and the specific thing, and Christian Watson's a good one. I don't know if you necessarily did this with your Christian Watson case. I saw this referenced a lot, his yards per route run 2+, and it put him in a cohort of a lot of receivers that was like a lot rushed. Of really great receivers. Yes. Right. Yeah. And for me, so I wasn't as on Christian Watson. So this is maybe a bad example because we just got done saying that it's not about one player.
No, it's
great. I'm certainly not trying to be like, this is a guy I faded and JJ said was right, and I'm going on his podcast. And
this is great. This is why lay round perspectives exists. Let's hear it.
Yeah. So the yards per route run is a stat that I love to break down into the 2 component parts: targets per route run, yards per target. Mm-hmm. And I wrote about this a lot. And it's not like I even said to fade Christian Watson. I still ranked him pretty high. Most of my readers know that I was not really on drafting him a lot. He was the year 2 profile that you want to be after for a lot of reasons, right? He had the draft capital, very efficient in year 1. We know that efficiency leads to more volume from young players. So like I spent a lot of time talking about Christian Watson, about why I wasn't as in on him as I should have been. And I got that question a lot because it fit a lot of the other players that I've been in on. And a big reason was, it goes back to the contextual, like watching the games and things like that, where I felt like he was a tail outcome 2.0 yards per out run guy for that cohort, right? In the sense that he didn't really fit with A.J. Brown or some of these other rookie. And the reason was, he had, first of all, didn't run a ton of routes, right? Like, and I'm sure you talked a lot about the sample size as it relates to him. He had Aaron Rodgers and then doesn't have Aaron Rodgers this year. So the yards per target side of it, the efficiency side, you could expect to potentially come down. The targets per route run side was really strong. And that's the one that I spent a lot of time on, targets per route run, and I got a lot of questions about. And I was basically saying I thought his targets per route run were inflated. And I didn't really have a good reason for arguing that, other than like, it felt like they were trying to funnel him volume last year. And there was even a game where they tried to throw to him a couple times near the goal line, and then they interviewed Aaron Rodgers after the game. They were like 2 scores up. They didn't score. They kicked a field goal, and they interviewed. And so it didn't matter. They interviewed Aaron Rodgers after the game, and he makes a little comment like, if he wants to win the Rookie of the Year, he's going to have to make plays like that. And it's like, wait, you're like actually very aware of what his stats are. You're trying to get him touchdowns. You went to him twice in a row. He dropped the TD. And so and then another stat that I saw this offseason that I used to try to make this point, Bill Barnwell shared a stat at one point that was like percentage of yards for wide receivers that were accumulated while win probability was 75% or higher or something. And so similar to that situation where like once they got into these like end of game situations, it seemed like they were trying to pad Christian Watson's stats every week, it felt like. And that was part of me writing Stealing Signals every week, being like, yeah, I mean, he had another great stat line, but like a lot of this production, the game wasn't even like they didn't need it to help them win. It was like they were trying to just get him the ball late. And it was interesting, but that's what it felt like to me. And I had a hard time explaining it. But the point was that he then winds up in this cohort of yards per out run, and so the targets per out run, the yards per target, both of them for me were maybe a little bit, room for them to regress more so than being predictive of like success in a way that when I watched A.J. Brown's rookie year, I was like, this guy's a gam. He can go out and just win, right? Like, and it's a very nuanced belief, but it is one of those things where like, again, I was getting back to that point about there's context, and I felt like Watson was a tail outcome that didn't belong in this cohort for whatever reason. And I mean, again, hard tacit knowledge thing, hard to explain. It's just A, B, C were all present, and so I didn't love it.
Yeah. I mean, but here's the thing. Because I did that cohort, that grouping and talked about it, and my stance on Watson in particular, and I know that we're using this as an example, and this is, I think that going through this example is just helpful to sort of understand what we're talking about. But like my stance with Watson was purely a redraft stance. My dynasty stance was this is a very, very volatile asset, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of it was because of that. Like the same thing happened with me with Gabe Davis last year. Not this past in 2022.
And I was in on Gabe too.
Yeah. Right. So I wasn't that into him in redraft last year, but it was also this notion that people really can't wrap their heads around the idea of buying into a young up and coming player more in redraft than in dynasty, because they assume that a younger player is going to naturally be more valuable in dynasty than in redraft, but the cost is totally different, right? Like Christian Watson to me, part of the reason why, and I talked about this a lot on my show, part of the reason I didn't mind drafting Christian Watson and Drake London is because things got so flat in fantasy drafts, at wide receiver around that time, where you could really make up for a miss by just pounding wide receiver in round 5, 6, 7, 8, etc. if you were getting them in round 4 or 5. And so it was easier to sort of swallow that variance with those guys. And obviously hasn't really panned out for them. But I think that's one piece of it too. But this leads me to what I really want to discover this offseason and research this offseason is that I think there's a lot of signal. I know there's some because I researched it a little bit at the end of this summer. I think there's going to be a lot of signal with what my prospect scores say and how that relates to not dynasty, but redraft. And you look at the grouping that Christian Watson was in of these guys who dominated their rookie season in yards per route run, every other wide receiver that was part of that group was an elite prospect entering the league.
Yeah.
And Christian Watson was not that. He was not that.
Yeah.
And so I think that all these like these tertiary things that you're sort of thinking of and putting together right now, which are all very, very valid, I think that you might be able to dumb it down and saying he just isn't as good as these other guys. Like he's just not as talented and was never in that same grouping, which is why he was a second round pick who probably should have been a third round pick if not for his athleticism, Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think the whole reason I was going through his production with such a fine-tooth comb during the season and, this is all in garbage time and Aaron Rodgers is getting the ball is because I didn't like him as a prospect for the reasons you said.
Right.
And so I was like, no, but this breakout isn't real. I wasn't wrong about him in Dynasty. Like, he's not actually good. This is all fake, right? Like,
right.
And so that definitely was part of it for me as well, where and to your point, I think that's exactly right about that cohort. I mean, that's probably why he was a tail outcome for, like, you can't just look at him from a 2.0 yards per route run. There's other important context, right? Yeah. Like that is a good signal, part of it, but there's other context. And for him, to your point, I mean, the prospect profile is still very relevant. And what's so funny about this, we're saying all this, what could still happen is he's had an injury plagued first half. He could go on to dominate the second half and go on to be a really good NFL player, right?
Like we should be, we're open to that kind of thing. But like I have the year 2 model and Christian Watson was not part of there were 3 wide receivers who were part of the elite group, which was Chris Olave, Garrett Wilson, and Drake London. And I still stand by Drake London being a phenomenal player. And I think that situationally, it definitely didn't really, obviously was part of the range of outcomes. We knew this was probable, but I was willing to buy into what if everyone's wrong, because he could have easily then been a wide receiver 1 in fantasy, my opinion. So I don't really hate on that as much as that process, as much as the Christian Watson one, because of the lack of backbone from a prospect profile standpoint, because his year 2 model score was in the same grouping as Treylon, Jahan Dotson, George Pickens, all of those guys.
Massive hits.
Yeah, exactly. And so like I knew that going. So that's a little teaser for like the off season and stuff, and for next year's draft guide is that I would almost guarantee you that there's going to be a lot more of the prospect stuff that's integrating more within redraft, because I think that's one of the big missing pieces. I have a lot of thinking to do just around that in general. Let's move on to there's a player take I want to talk about here. Do you have anything you want to add about the Christian Watson stuff?
No, I mean, I think that's a great example of what we were just talking about. And you're not reacting just to Christian Watson. You're reacting to a set of outcomes, right? We were talking about, like, we don't want to just change our whole process for one play, but we do want to self-analyze. And it's just such a great example of what we were talking about.
It's a perfect example. It's a perfect example. So let's move on to one player that I've talked about a good bit on this show. I was in on him this season. He has not panned out, and he's really getting a lot of hate right now in the fantasy space, and that's Tony Pollard. So my stance right now is that I still think Tony Pollard is a buy in fantasy football, and I want to hear you just be totally honest. I don't need people to come on this show and just agree with me, but tell me how idiotic I am, because I know that a lot of people are going to have listened to me and they're like, oh, you're just doubling down on a bad take. I don't care I don't care how I felt about these guys in August and September. I'm saying right now, where the market is at with Tony Pollard and the sentiment around Tony Pollard, I am much more on the buy side than the sell side. Could it continue to go south? Could they use Rico Dowdle more? Yeah, of course. But I still think that the way people are, like, I've seen people say they're going to bench him this week in fantasy. They're 10.5 point favorites against Carolina. I mean, I can't imagine that you have, 2 or 3 more better options than Tony Pollard. Just tell me how stupid I am for sticking with him right now from the perspective that the market shifted. Obviously, I don't think he's the same player that he was in August, entering the season. But, am I wrong for still thinking that he's a buy candidate?
No, he's obviously still a buy candidate. You're not wrong at all. I mean, there are concerns that have cropped up, but like I actually wrote about him pretty extensively recently as well. And I mean, my thing was he was so similar in hindsight, I guess, as a bet to Austin Eckler the year he broke out, where Austin Eckler was a 26-year-old who had never been the full-time lead back and was a little older than we'd like to see. And then the other key part of it was, well, now that he's going to be the clear lead back, is he going to get the goal line work? And that was the big question about Austin Eckler. And he goes on, up to that point, he had 14 and 11, 25 career touchdowns. He had 20 TDs that season as a 26-year-old. So 4 years, 25 TDs over 4 years. Age 26 season, he goes in and puts up 20. And then age 27 season, he puts up 18. And, he has 5 this year. He's been hurt a little bit, but he's scoring, at a decent clip this year as well. Led the league in touchdowns the last 2 years. Going into that 2021 season, I don't think you could have found anyone that would have been concerned about his efficiency because he was always an efficient player. Yeah. He gets enough receiving work. All of that stuff is fine. It was just, will he get the touchdowns? Yep. And then he got them, and he became a league winner for 2 seasons. Tony Pollard gets the receiving. Wait, no, now this year he doesn't for some reason. Very efficient player. Nobody would have told you coming into this year that he's inefficient, that he's anything other than an explosive, efficient player. And for some reason, he's no longer able to be efficient. And I've seen so many people reference the injury. Isn't it that simple? I referenced the injury early in the offseason, was a little concerned until I did a little research and had people talking to me about it. And all of the Twitter doctors and the people that do this type of research seem to be in pretty much agreement that this is like an 8-week injury and he's got 7 months to heal. He's going to be fine. Right. And so unless something went wrong with the surgery or unless it somehow impacted his offseason workout. We don't necessarily know every detail about every player. Sometimes I think about that. Like, we joke about the best shape of your life thing, but there probably is something to some players being a little more motivated some off seasons, eating better, working out better. There's certainly years of my life where I've been healthier and years that I've been less healthy. Right. And that's just going to be part of it. And so maybe he's not in the best shape of his life. Who knows? But we wouldn't have any idea about that. But the reality is, the goal line work is there. I mean, Rico Dowdle's doing well, but the goal line work is there. He's still a big part of their passing game, should be. A lot of their games in the first half of the season, this is a big part of it for me, have been massive blowouts. They've played an absurd amount. I mean, I wrote about this recently, but 4 or 5 of their games have been 3-score games at halftime, and early blowouts because of the defensive TDs and stuff. Week 1 was one against the Giants. They got blown out by the Niners similarly. I don't think it was quite as big of a blowout at halftime in that game, but they've blown out multiple other teams. They're not all coming to my head. The Rams recently was one. Anyway, when you're playing a lot of games where in the second half you're not even in competitive. I mean, there's maybe an argument for he's not trying to create as many big plays. Maybe he's just covering up the ball and doing what he's supposed to do and those things. It's tricky. Obviously, I'm not trying to make too many excuses for him, but the volume is there. And even in the sense of, I think running back efficiency is not discussed enough. It is important, but even in the sense of him being an inefficient back, if he can just get back the old way that we've always talked about it for 10 plus years in fantasy. And I'm not trying to say this is outdated or anything. My Stealing Bananas co-host Sean Siegel still does it all the time. He's one of my absolute favorite analysts in the whole industry. Yeah. But the idea of expected points and points over expected. The old idea of just he's been way below expectation in terms of, what his actual role is. We probably should expect that to regress somewhat. I mean, even if he's not adding points, even if he's not efficient, he should be somewhere in the middle, close to. Right. It's so I think he's a buy on those terms, but it is a really complicated one. And there are a couple concerning names that like, the comps start to come out. I saw somebody reference Davis Maddock referenced Ben Tate on Twitter the other day. One name that came to me was like Tevin Coleman or a couple names, Kareem Hunt. These are guys that were efficient, younger, and then about 26, they lost their efficiency.
Yeah, Lamar Miller was another one.
Lamar Miller, and all of them non-elite prospects, like round 2 to round 4 prospects. They weren't like round 1 guys, and they were good early, but maybe they just aged a little earlier than you would expect them to. But then you go back to Eckler as the other side of it, where like this guy's continued to be explosive and efficient. It's not like I don't know. I still think he's a buy. The other thing I will say about Dallas, a trend right now, the last 3 games they've been plus 8% or more in pass rate over expected. They only had one game where they're even positive, better than plus 0 in the whole pre-bye segment of their season. Since the bye, they've come out throwing a ton. But that might actually help open up lighter boxes for Pollard.
Yeah. And they'll probably be better offensively because we know that passing is just more effective than running is. But here's the thing. You mentioned he might not regress the full way, but maybe a little bit. That's the thing, is that like his expected touchdowns right now, according to PFF's expected fantasy points model and expected touchdown model, is 9, right? So he was expected to score 9 touchdowns, which means he's played 7 touchdowns below expectation. Even if he were to score 6 touchdowns instead of 9, right, which is only 2/3 of the way there, he would be a low-end RB1 in PPR right now on a points per game basis. The narrative shifts completely. And I got to give a shout out to my buddy Rich Rebar, our buddy Rich Rebar, who, he sent a text about this where it was this comparison between 2 players, okay? And I didn't take the exact data that he shared in this text message. I looked it up myself and just kind of picked out other data points. But there's a player A and a player B, running back A, running back B. Player A, yards per carry 3.9. Player B, yards per carry 3.9. Player A, expected points added per rush minus 0.13. Player B, minus 0.19. So player B a little bit worse than expected points per rush, but they both suck. Player A, success rate, 35.6%. Player B, 38.5%. So player B had a worse expected points added per rush, but a better success rate. So he's gaining positive points for his team at a more consistent rate. And then percentage of carries that are 10 or more yards, 8.8% for player A, 7.4% for player B. So player A, a little bit more explosive. Player A, Ben, you ready for this? Player A, well, I'll say this. Player B is Tony Pollard, okay?
Okay.
Player A is Travis Etienne. Like it is.
That's great. Yeah.
The narrative around these two guys is totally different. Where you have Etienne, his expected points per game this year is 15.3. Tony Pollard's is 17.1. It's just that Etienne's playing 3.1 points over that expectation, and Tony Pollard's playing 4.5 points under that expectation. Now, I would 100% take Travis Etienne over Tony Pollard rest of season. That's not what I'm arguing or talking about here at all. What I am saying is that you can take advantage to overall sentiment and feeling about these players big time in the market. And I think right now you look at their rest of season schedule, really favorable. I mean, even this week, I wouldn't be shocked if he has a decent outing. I really do think that at the end of the day, a lot of this is just small sample variance and touchdown related. Like and it might not come to fruition this year. That's the thing. Like it might just be a bad year for Tony Pollard, right? He might not really regress as much as we are hoping or expecting or anything like that. But I just do think that people are taking this way, way too far right now.
100%. And I think the ETN comp is a great example of why he should be a buy, because the point of that and what you're driving home is like, it's not like ETN's been like massively efficient. I mean, he has 8 touchdowns. Like you just talked about how Pollard only has 2. What if he had 6? Mm-hmm. If he had 8, we would literally be thinking he was Travis. I mean, it's the exact same thing.
It's the exact same. If Tony Pollard had 8 touchdowns right now or 7 touchdowns right now, we would be not even having this conversation. We wouldn't be talking about it whatsoever. Even if he was super inefficient. I mean, there's so many running backs that are inefficient that no one cares about. I mean, I know that like there's been conversations about like Joe Mixon for the last like 8 years, it feels like at this point, with him being like not that effective as a runner, but he's more of the exception than the rule. I mean, like we see seasons all the time where guys are just not nearly as effective, but if they can find the end zone, they can get a little bit lucky there, and maybe they see inflated target shares or something, like all of a sudden, no one cares about how good the actual player is. The only reason people care about how bad Tony Pollard has been is because he hasn't been able to find the end zone.
Yeah, and I think part of it as well is It's because he hasn't been found in the end zone, and he doesn't look like he did last year in terms of
not totally.
like, the explosiveness, the
Yeah.
efficiency. Yeah. And so, like, even the Mixon point, because I just wanted to hit on that real quick. People have made that comp, and I do think he's playing a lot like, I wrote this recently, he's playing a lot like 2022 Joe Mixon. The difference is Mixon has had that issue for years. Like you said, it was he's been an inefficient player for years. That might just be who he is. Tony Pollard has not been this guy at any other point until these like 8 games. So it's a little bit different. It goes back to, sort of like the Christian Watson thing, where it's a little, there's a slight difference in the past profile. If we take a little bit of a longer view on this player, a little bit of a difference. I mean, I don't think he's Mixon. I mean, I actually do think, like, most likely he has a couple long touchdowns the rest of the way. He has in every year of his career.
Right.
Like, it's weird that he hasn't done it so far. You were saying it's small sample. I completely agree. I think, ETN's had a couple long touchdowns. Like, he's going to have a couple like ETN has had. His profile's probably going to look... I mean, you said you would obviously take ETN more, which we kind of have to say because otherwise people are going to be on our mentions.
Right.
But I was sitting here thinking, like, I probably rank them pretty close. Honestly, like, they're not that different, right?
Yeah, I mean, like, there's... It's one of those things where you just kind of have to, like, keep things rolling the way they've been rolling, with, like, a guy like ETN and stuff. And, like, they're clearly cool with feeding him. And I do think that they obviously need more balance, whereas Dallas is going in this other direction. And, pass rate does matter from the standpoint of, like, how teams score touchdowns. Like, that's one of the big reasons why I would care about pass rate and Dallas's pass rate a little bit. But yeah, man, I mean, like, it's not that dramatic of a difference between those two guys. And right now, you could get Pollard plus probably another pretty elite player for Travis Etienne. Like, straight up, right?
Right.
And so that's why I'm like, play the market.
I'd probably make that trade. I would probably take the second elite player and go make that trade.
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
I think...
And very rarely am I doing 2-for-1s like that. So we're pushing the time a little bit here, but I do have a couple questions I really want to ask you. We talked earlier about sort of scheme and how that impacts the way that you view fantasy football. And I think one of the things that we've seen this year, at least with 2 very obvious examples, is smaller running backs sort of being more viable in fantasy. You have Devon Achane crushing it. Hopefully he's back this weekend. And then Keaton Mitchell plays tonight. And so we're recording this on Thursday. I say this every week. If, we don't have to give up a player take on Keaton Mitchell here because something's going to happen tonight and then people are going to listen the next day and people are going to call us morons and all this kind of stuff. And I just don't want to deal with that, right? This is more of a high level discussion. Do you think that there's a real shift here with these smaller running backs being more viable? Or do you think that this is a small sample, we haven't seen enough of it, and more than likely the trend that we've seen historically, which is bigger running backs are generally better in fantasy, is what we're going to end up seeing?
I think it's a little bit of both, right? I think some of the scheme stuff we talked about and actually shifted the math a little bit. We're talking about like the cover 2 shells and more DBs on the field is a big part of it, right? There's always a nickel corner on the field and some of those things. So you have these lighter defenses. One of the big trends, though, is like teams are not as efficient as they were last year running the ball suddenly this year. The defenses seem to have gotten better on that side of it, where in 2022, the explosive pass rate was down, but it was one of the most efficient rushing seasons of all time. The yards per carry was the most efficient of all time. 2023, we've seen that fall back down a little bit. And I think, like, I don't know the X's and O's well enough, but I know some of it has to do with the quality of interior defensive linemen and some of the things that they're able to do with lighter fronts, still being able to plug up some of these holes. Having said all of that, like there's still lighter defenses. You're still going to see, I think, the creative offenses are based around the outside zone running. And so like Mike McDaniel, he wanted Achane for speed, right? The ability to get him on the edge and explode. The Keaton Mitchell big plays we've seen so far, big plays on the edge a lot of the time. That's also been traditionally the case for lighter back. When Chris Johnson was hitting and Jamal Charles was hitting, that's what it looked like. And so there is still an element of like, you got to be able to stand up to a lot of hits to play the running back position. I think coaches are going to still have a bias towards weight at the goal line, which is really important for running back roles. I think lighter receivers is a stronger trend because it is based on the rule changes of defensive holding and illegal contact. And these guys are allowed to move free a lot more. And so then once you're allowed to move free as receivers, you don't need the physicality to break through hand fighting as much. Mm-hmm. And then the fact that you're actually faster, the other element to the light side of it, right? Like, because the 220, 230 pound receivers, there's not a whole lot of AJ Browns out there, right? Like they can't also be super, super fast. So now suddenly what wins is speed. Speed kills, right? Like you can get Tyreek on short motion and get him open on every single play. Like, that's the most dominant thing in the game right now at receiver. That's harder at running back to think about from a scheme perspective. And because, like, at receiver, you're not taking as many hits. Like, you still have to be able to take a lot of hits at running back, right? So for me, I think there's a little bit of it. I think we can certainly buy into some of the running backs, but I don't think I'm like buying it as like a clear shift, the way I do think there's more signal at receiver.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I also think two things. Number one, if a running back's going to be smaller, which, look, I did a study on this over the offseason. You guys can look at lateround.com, the newsletter archives. There's a newsletter I sent out that was a study about running back weight, and see that the data is very clear that running backs, and I didn't just say, oh, every running back under 200 pounds is bad. It's more so I bucketed players. You can see that the drop-off really generally occurs around like 210-ish. And I say generally, like, it's not like I faded Jahmyr Gibbs. I liked Jahmyr Gibbs after he got drafted 12th overall, and I dug into that a little bit more. So look at that to get like very concrete, at least data, on the subject. But my stance, honestly, is that number one, you need elite speed to make up and compensate for, the smaller weight, like we see with both Keaton Mitchell and Devon Achane. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I think everything you said is totally right with the way that defenses are playing right now and the kind of personnel that's on the field. But I think the other piece to this is that I think that smaller backs might have been fine throughout history. It's just that coaches haven't chosen to put them on the field.
Selection bias. Yeah.
The end of the day, it's really just that bias of, I think that we need this bruiser. If I have a smaller back, he has to be in more of a satellite back role. And then you look at a player like, Austin Eckler's smaller-ish. Raheem Mostert is a smaller-ish back from a weight perspective. And realistically, they're generally fine. I know that, Mostert hasn't been able to stay healthy throughout his career, but, I do think that there is still a bias there with the way that these coaches are just generally using these guys. If we see a trend where more and more coaches, I think that forward-thinking coaches, like a Mike McDaniel,
younger coaches,
like they're the ones who, and look, even like Harbaugh has at least, embraced a lot of the progressive movements within football in the NFL. And so
one of the names that comes to mind is Kyron Williams, who is lighter and isn't actually like an elite speed guy. It's a McVay offense again. He's a one. But I think you might be onto something here where it might just be the coaches that are willing to try it, right? Like McVay's another young coach who's like, we like him.
My stance has never been that smaller backs are bad. My stance has been smaller backs are not great for fantasy football, which is a totally different thing, because I think that I actually aesthetically, I prefer smaller running backs. Like I actually like play into that more and my own biases and the types of running backs that I enjoy watching, right? Whereas like Deuce Vaughn is fun. He's awesome, right? I like these kinds of backs. But if Deuce Vaughn were to see a big workload in Dallas's offense, I bet he wouldn't be that bad. I think it's just this bias that coaches have that, we can't use this guy because of X, Y, and Z, because we think that, he's going to get, maybe Deuce Vaughn is a terrible example, but you get my point these smaller guys can see a bigger work. They did it in college oftentimes, right? A lot of these guys saw a lot of work in college. So I think that's one of the
certainly possible, but I think it is gray area, and I do think it's worth, as a counterpoint, like Kyron Williams got hurt. Devon Achane got hurt. Keaton Mitchell missed a lot of the time this year after, a preseason injury. Like, these, can they hold up to the elite size of NFL defenders? Like, I don't know that we have, that's a small sample of a couple names, but the ones that we're talking about have all missed time this year. So, I mean, there's that element too.
And from a process standpoint, it's not like the research I did said fade Devon Achane. He's one of my highest rostered players this year. He was a player to target in the draft guide. Like, this is what we were talking about earlier, where we're looking at the probably, but if you overlay things like scheme and situation, I would not have been on Devon Achane on any other situation, unless he went to like San Francisco and Christian McCaffrey wasn't there, right? So like this was that's the reason why I was in on Achane. I think Achane could work in other environments now that we've seen him in the NFL, but at least entering the league and fantasy drafts and such, obviously Miami was like the perfect spot for him. But still, I mean, like, you can still say, hey, running back weight matters, but I still like Devon Achane. It's fine to say that.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
All right. I got one more question I want to ask you. The season's not over yet, but what do you think that when the season's over, you're going to look back? What's going to be sort of the lesson that you learned based on the 2023 season? I know that we try not to use one season to sort of overshadow and sort of change our processes completely. But is there something that you're going to walk away from this year, do you think? And obviously it's still week 11, but is there something that you're going to walk away from this season and say, I think that I'm going to change my approach a little bit and maybe implement this strategy in 2024?
I don't know that it's a huge strategy thing, but the trend that I think is the most glaring to me right now, and I did a little research on it for my Stealing Signals intro this week, and I do think it's going to be a big talking point for next offseason, is number one receivers. And it's particularly relevant for me because for a long time I've said like not to think of it like number one and number two, because wide receivers are running routes simultaneously. It's not like running back where there's, the playing time matters a lot. I've often said, like, think of it like two number ones. Jamar Chase and T. Higgins are two number ones. They both have these great independently strong profiles. Take a longer view like we were talking about and look at their prospect profiles coming up and their efficiency as young players. They're both great in their own right. That's great. But to the RPO stuff that we talked about a little bit this offseason and to what we've actually seen in the 2023 data, I do think there's a lot to be learned about why teams – there's actually data behind this. I did a big research for the introduction to Stealing Signals, where I looked at the percentage of overall wide receiver and tight end scoring that has been accounted for by each team's top scoring player. So it's either wide receiver or tight end.
Sure.
If the top scorer is Travis Kelce, then it's Travis Kelce. Over the last decade, 2023 is a lot higher of a rate. I also hypothesized that maybe that's because over a full season, some of these guys are getting hurt and stuff. So I only looked at the top 20 highest percentages, like the teams that had the highest percentages, so like the most dominant number ones.
Yeah.
And 2023 was still the clear winner. And then I also only looked at the top 10. 2023 was still the clear winner. So each of these little like groupings, the idea was what percentage of the NFL's overall passing, receiving points are going to the team's top option. And for the whole league for 2023, it's 33.5%. Last year it was 29.8. It was 30 the year prior, 30.0, 28.3 the year prior. So like high 20s and 30%, it's jumped like 3.5 percentage points. The next highest year is way back in 2015. And I went back a whole decade because we used to have, like, you remember when Brandon Marshall had the 40% target share for a whole season? Yeah. We used to have more number ones. Like, this is something that people like you and I have been doing this for a long time. That we knew that, like, the number one target shares have fallen off over time as we've seen more three receiver sets and more spread offenses. And that's been the reason that we've explained it. But it's come back this year and even heavier than. So the second highest season in the last decade is 2015. The third highest is 2014, the two earliest seasons of the last decade. But those are still a full percentage point and 2 full percentage points lower than 2023. So it is a lot more concentrated, and we've seen it with the results in fantasy at the top of drafts where all of those early receivers are smashing, except the ones that got hurt. Like Kupp got banged up. But Jefferson, when healthy, Chase, obviously, with when Burrow's been healthier, he's been doing very, very well. Tyreek is smashing. A.J. Brown is smashing. CeeDee Lamb is absolutely smashing. Amon-Ra St. Brown is smashing. Right? Just go on and on and on. Right. Garrett Wilson, despite losing Aaron Rodgers, is doing good. So well that I think everybody's pretty confident that if Aaron Rodgers was there, he'd be probably smashing. Right? Like, I mean, Devontae Adams, another situationally not great. Stephon Diggs, smashing. Right? Like there's not a miss there. Like just a couple years ago, we had a lot of misses in the first couple rounds at receiver, and it was Cooper Kupp and Jamar Chase and those guys that, mid-round receivers. He was going in the fourth, up in the fourth, and Chase in the fifth, and Debo was in the eighth. And those guys were the stars that year at the receiver position. This year, you're not seeing the fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh round receivers that are climbing. The top of the receiver board is all of the guys we knew were elite number ones, and they are dominating more than they ever have. And I don't know what, like, there's a lot of research on first read targets. I've written a little bit about having some issues with the ways that data is compiled. But the whole concept of first read targets is interesting as it relates to the RPO stuff we were talking about. Because the offense is on RPOs or the line or they're run blocking, you get the ineligible downfield if the ball doesn't go to the first read. So it has to go to the first read. I do think there's something to that. We're probably seeing more RPOs. But I also think there's something to the cover two shells and the ways the defense are doing, and they're rolling into coverages. I've seen some interesting data that's shown that when the defenses roll into single high, the number ones are dominating. And so it's against two high, it's more split, but against single high, the offense is like counterpunch to the schematic thing is we're going to get the ball to our guy. Like he's in single coverage probably or something. I don't know all the X's and O's, but Jamar Chase and Tyreek Hill and all these guys are crushing single high looks. And so I need to learn more about it from people who actually know the X's and O's. But I do think going forward, something that I've done for a long time is say, there's no number one on the Bengals. Jamar Chase and T. Higgins are both number ones. I'm going to go away from that going forward. That's not correct. The number ones dominate in certain situations, and being the number one is really relevant. I think to the way that the offenses are counterpunching the too high and all that stuff. It's a big trend in 2023. The fact that all these big name receivers are just absolutely smashing.
That's awesome. That is awesome insight. All of this has been awesome, man. Thank you so much for hopping on and joining. Let everyone know where they can find you.
Thank you for having me on. It has been an absolute blast to chat with you. Stealing Signals is a Substack you can find at bengretch.substack.com. It is a premium Substack, but you can just join the free newsletter. I send my introductions to Stealing Signals every week are usually all in front of the paywall. A lot of just higher level stuff. If you enjoy this kind of stuff, a lot of that's on the free side. You don't even have to subscribe for that. And then Stealing Bananas, the podcast, Ship Chasing, the podcast, Stealing Lions, a betting project I do. Those are all the places to find me.
Awesome, man. I'm on Twitter at LateRoundQB. You can find all my work over on lateround.com. Make sure you're subscribed to the YouTube channel. Parts of this show, video-wise, will be on the YouTube channel, youtube.com/@LateRoundFF. Otherwise, everyone, thank you for tuning in.